Secretary of State Steve Reid.
Thank you. With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to update the House on Storm Bert. The storm brought heavy rain, high winds and snow across the UK over the weekend. The Flooding Minister and I are receiving regular updates on the flooding in England. Our thoughts and our sympathies are with all those who have been affected. This morning, I held an emergency meeting with the Environment Agency Chief Executive Philip Duffy to discuss the flooding response and ongoing plans to protect communities. I was briefed on the latest situation, the 24/7 response being led by the Environment Agency and the emergency services, and the actions being taken to further protect communities in the coming days, with river levels expected to rise further in some places. We discussed how to bolster the response from the Environment Agency, emergency services and local authorities if required. Flooding in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is dealt with by the devolved authorities. The Prime Minister spoke to the First Minister for Wales on Sunday, and the Welsh Government has activated its crisis management arrangements in support of the local response. We have offered additional support to our colleagues in Wales if and when that is required. I would like to put on record my thanks to the emergency responders, local authorities and the Environment Agency for their immense efforts to help communities across the country. Around 28,000 properties have been protected by Environment Agency flood defences. Unfortunately, an estimated 107 properties have flooded across England, principally from river and surface water flooding. While Storm Bert has now passed, we will continue to see the impacts of this weekend's heavy rainfall over the next few days. Environment Agency staff are continuing their work across the country and are engaging closely with local resilience forums and local responders, with arrangements in place to scale up their response if and when that is needed. As of 4 p.m. today, there is one severe flood warning in place, 120 flood warnings and 145 flood alerts in force across England. A severe flood warning, which reflects a danger to life, was issued in the early hours of this morning and relates to the Billing Aquadrome on the River Nene in Northamptonshire, where the caravan park was safely evacuated. This is the fourth time the Aquadrome has been flooded in recent years, and I would like to thank local responders for their swift actions to protect those most at risk. The Environment Agency and local responders have also been busy protecting properties elsewhere in England, including flooding from the River Teme in Tenbury Wells, where around 40 properties have flooded. The river has now peaked, and local responders will be focusing on the lower reaches of rivers over the next few days. There has been a focus on the Calder Valley in West Yorkshire, the River Weaver in Cheshire, and the River Avon in Bath, including Chippenham and Bradford upon Avon. Further flooding is sadly likely over the next few days as water levels rise in slower flowing rivers such as the Severn and the Ouse. The Environment Agency anticipates that any impacts should be less severe than we've seen in recent days. Storm Bert also caused disruption to road and rail networks. Our transport industry has well-established plans to respond to severe weather and get affected transport networks running smoothly as quickly as possible. National Highways, local highway teams and Network Rail staff have been working all weekend to reduce floodwater and remove fallen trees from roads and railways. Unfortunately, residual floodwater is affecting the Great Western Main Line, the Midland Main Line and other branch lines, and this continues to affect passengers' journeys. The safety of passengers, train crew and staff is always the top priority, and railway lines will be reopened as soon as it is safe for trains to run. Climate change will inevitably lead to more severe weather of the kind we've seen this weekend. As Secretary of State for the Environment, I have made it my priority to improve our flood defences and drainage systems to keep people and businesses safe. This government inherited flood defences in the worst condition on record following years of underinvestment by the previous government. Over 3,000 of our key flood defences are below an acceptable standard. That is why we are investing £2.4 billion over the next 2 years to build and maintain flood defences. We've also set up a new Floods Resilience Task Force to make sure there is better coordination between central government and the frontline agencies on the ground up and down the country. This brings together organisations including the Association of Drainage Authorities, the National Farmers Union, Local Resilience Forum and emergency responders. It is key to strengthening resilience in the face of floods, and it met for the first time in September to prepare for the autumn and for the winter. We've provided £60 million in the recent budget to help farmers affected by the unprecedented flooding earlier this year, and I'm pleased to tell the House that the bulk of these payments are already in farmers' bank accounts. We have confirmed an additional £50 million will be distributed to internal drainage boards to manage water levels to protect agriculture and the environment, and we will launch a consultation in the new year which will include a review of the existing flood funding formula to ensure challenges facing businesses and rural and coastal communities are taken into account when delivering flood protection. We aim to bring in that new approach from April 2026. I'd like to repeat, Madam Deputy Speaker, my thanks to the emergency services, local authorities and the Environment Agency for their work to keep communities safe during Storm Bert. I will continue to receive updates from the Environment Agency and their teams on the ground, and I will continue to ensure that members across the House are contacted when flooding affects their constituency.
I call Shadow Minister Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Storm Bert has and continues to have terrible impacts across the United Kingdom. Our thoughts are with the loved ones of those who have lost their lives in recent days, as well as the people whose homes and businesses have been devastated, and all of the communities affected by flooding and this weather. I understand the distress, the anger, and frankly the exhaustion that many will be feeling today as they contemplate the process of rebuilding their homes, businesses and communities, as my own constituency suffered terrible damage a year ago with Storm Babette. Residents need practical support quickly, and they also need some reassurance for the future. I'd like to thank the emergency services, the local authorities and the Environment Agency in their efforts to help people quickly and often in dangerous circumstances. But I would also like to thank the members of the public who have stepped in to help their neighbours and local communities in countless ways. They are the rays of kindness in what has been a dark weekend for many communities. Now, the government needs to focus on how help will be given to those who have been driven out of their homes, including the provision of decent temporary accommodation, the repair and reopening of schools, as well as the process for speeding up insurance claims so that residents can return home as quickly as possible, knowing, as we do sadly from previous storms, how important members across this House will be in helping their constituents. Will the Secretary of State commit to ensuring that his department sends a daily operational update to members across the House so that members may help their constituents assiduously? Last week, his department will have received data from the Met Office about the severity of this storm and its likely impacts. So that we can understand the urgency that the Secretary of State gave to these warnings, could he tell us, please, the discussions that he had with the Environment Agency and the Met Office before the storm hit and when, and what actions were implemented as a result of any such meetings? He has mentioned his government's flood resilience task force that was set up to improve flood preparedness. It has met once since July, and its next meeting is next year. He has just said that its duty is to prepare for the autumn and winter. Can he list precisely what the preparations are arising out of that meeting and the practical impacts on communities up and down the country? Now, regrettably, with the threat of flooding still present, and indeed, as I rose to my feet, one severe flood warning was still in place and 120 flood warnings as well, the Secretary of State descended into playing politics. And so to correct him, I will just set out these facts, and there's a question for him to answer at the end of it. The last Conservative government committed a record £5.2 billion from 2021 until 2027 to provide significantly improved flooding defences across the country. This is critical and long-standing infrastructure work. Will he confirm that the £2.4 billion he has referenced is part of that £5.2 billion or in addition to it? The Conservatives ring-fenced £100 million to help those communities threatened repeatedly by flooding, called the Frequently Flooded Allowance. Will the government confirm the continuance of this fund and its ring-fencing? When is the next assessment for this scheme? And can communities flooded through Storm Bert be included? We also set up the Natural Flood Management Fund to complement traditional bricks and mortar defences. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this will be continued? And I note that the Secretary of State has mentioned funding independent drainage boards to the tune of £50 million. Can he confirm that this funding has been cut from the £75 million promised by the Conservatives, and why? And whilst I welcome the increase of £10 million at budget for the Farming Recovery Fund that was announced by the Conservative government to support farmers for last year's wet weather, can he confirm that he will announce new money to support farmers for this winter's bad weather? Yeah. And can he give comfort to the farmers watching that the Treasury will include adverse weather conditions and flooding as mitigations for their much criticised family farm tax? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I end by wishing every single community, whether they are the subject of those flood warnings or who are watching their weather updates with great concern, I wish everyone a safe and comfortable few days ahead. Yeah.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her comments and echo her good wishes to people who have been affected by the situation. She refers to funding. Of course, I would politely remind her she was a Treasury Minister in the previous government, which underfunded our flood defences and left over 3,000 of them in an inadequate state, which is the highest level on record being inadequate. She asks about appropriate support on the front line. The Flood Resilience Task Force exists to ensure that the agencies on the front line right across the country, local authorities and other agencies responsible, were ready for this and other storms when they happen and have made sure that appropriate support is in place for individuals, families and communities that may be affected, of course including those who are most vulnerable. My honourable friend, the Minister for Water, has already held a round table with insurance providers to ensure that we are speeding up support for those people who are affected by flooding. The Environment Agency will, of course, keep members updated on a very regular basis on the circumstances in their own constituencies. And returning back to funding, we've allocated £2.4 billion over the next 2 years. That is more per annum in each of those 2 years than the previous government allocated for the current year.
Chair of the Select Committee, Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I entirely empathise with my right honourable friend about what he has inherited. We had the perfect storm of massive funding cuts to the Environment Agency, with increased pressures from flooding as a result of climate change. Notwithstanding that, the need for improvements in our flood defences is absolutely urgent and critical. How can communities like mine in Chesterfield, flooded by the river Rother and Hipper, engage with the work that he's doing so that we are able to be more prepared, and so that the community can work with the Environment Agency to bridge the funding gap that we've been told on the existing scheme on the River Hipper, and right across the country, communities like those so appallingly flooded, who my heart goes out to because of what I've seen, need to know how we can work with the government to step up the urgency to make our country more flood prepared in the future.
I thank the chair of the committee for his questions, and of course I sympathise with residents in his constituency who will have been affected by the recent flooding and indeed previous flooding. The government is reviewing the flood funding formula so that we can look at making it more effective. That includes looking at nature-based flood management, things like planting more trees further upstream to help the land hold more water, so less rain when it comes is flooding downstream where it can cause more damage in more populated areas. That consultation will be involving businesses, rural communities, coastal communities, communities including his own, so that they can all feed in and we can make sure we have a flood funding formula that works for every single part of the country.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of the statement. The financial cost of the devastation caused by Storm Bert will run into many, many millions, and yet it is absolutely nothing compared to the heartbreaking loss of life. My prayers are for the loved ones of those who have died and the community so horrifically affected. I too am grateful to the emergency services of all kinds, council workers, Environment Agency, and to the communities who have pulled together and been wonderful neighbours to their neighbours up and down this country, and indeed to the many members who have got their hands dirty serving their constituencies. My honourable friend included the member for Chippenham, who, in the absence of any trains, hired a car this morning, left Parliament to get back to her communities to be with those who've been devastated by the flooding. This storm does highlight the foolishness of the government's real terms reduction in the DEFRA budget of 1.9% by 2026, which forms a threat to flood-affected communities, at least potentially via flood management schemes, through natural flood management, through specific projects such as those in Kendal and Appleby. So would the Secretary of State clarify that he may seek to reverse those cuts? Disruption to rail services has been significant too. Less than a year after the terrifying derailment at Grange over Sands, the whole of the Furness line in my constituency is now out of action until later this week. Will ministers put extra resources into ensuring that this vital line and others is upgraded and made more robust? Storm events also have an impact on our sewage networks. Research by the Save Windermere campaign estimates that storm overflows discharging untreated sewage into our lake began at 3:21 this morning, and that by midday could have reached a volume of 7 million litres. So will the government speed up action to prevent egregious storm overflows like this across our country? And finally, does he understand that given the crucial role farmers play in natural flood management, his decision to cut 76% of the basic payment scheme from next year could push farmers away from such schemes altogether, and will he revisit that decision?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his comments and for his question, and I share and echo his gratitude to members across the House for the work that they've carried out to support their local constituents and signpost them to appropriate support. And we will be making sure the Environment Agency continues to engage with members so they can continue carrying out that very important work. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman will be aware of the very, very difficult financial inheritance we had from the previous government. In that context, I think the fact that we've been been able to deliver an increase in funding for flooding is to be welcomed. £2.4 billion over the next 2 years means there is an increase in each of those years compared to the amount of funding provided by the previous government for the current year. He mentions as well storm overflows. Of course, it's extremely distressing to see when we have these more severe episodes of rain that more storm overflows will be discharging sewage into rivers, lakes and seas. Of course, Sir John Cunliffe is leading a wider review into the failures of governance and regulation that have led to this situation happening, and I'm sure he and his party members will be engaging with that. But in addition, we are requiring every single outflow to be monitored so we know what is going out into our rivers and can take appropriate action, including the strengthened powers provided by the Water Special Measures Bill going through the House right now.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Storm Bert has been devastating for my constituents. In Cymru, with its disused coal tips, 160 millimetres of rain fell in just 48 hours. Across Blaenau, Gwent and Rhymney, homes have been washed out, children's Christmas presents have been ruined, and families without insurance are counting the cost. Now, can I hugely welcome the 25 million in the budget for Welsh coalfield tip maintenance and safety measures. Made a big difference. Given, though, the extraordinary weather we saw on the weekend, will the Secretary of State please look again to see if further support is available for coal tips in the future?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I recognise the absolute devastation he describes that homeowners, business owners will have felt to see their homes devastated by flooding. The Prime Minister contacted and spoke to the First Minister for Wales on Sunday, and he made available any support for the Welsh Government that they may need to deal with the situation. That offer stands open, and we are ready to support colleagues in Wales if and when they require that, recognising that it was parts of Wales that have been the hardest hit by Storm Bert.
Llinos, Medi.
Diolch, Dyffryn Lefarydd. Plaid Cymru's thoughts are with all those across Wales affected by Storm Bert. Confirmation of a coal tip landslip in Cymru is extremely concerning and will lead to anxiety for others living near coal tips. These tips are the legacy of an industry that extracted from Wales to enrich London. Yet, the UK government has only pledged just 4% of the 600 million needed to secure them. Will the Secretary of State commit to providing the full funding required?
I thank her for her question, and again I share with her her concern about the situation that she's describing. This is the first government to have ever offered funding to support the problems of coal tips that she is describing. As I said to the previous question, the Prime Minister has made clear to the First Minister of Wales that this government stands ready to provide more support to the Welsh Government if that is required.
Josh Fenton-Glynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This weekend, much of my constituency was under a severe flood warning. Businesses, roads and homes were flooded. We were luckier than in previous years in terms of severity, but in places it was agonisingly close, centimetres away from rivers breaking their banks. Calder Valley has had 2 major floods in the past decade, and the fact that we avoided the same level of destruction this time is in no small part because of the work of local flood wardens, natural flood management organisations like Slow the Flow and Calderdale Council. I pay tribute to them. It's almost a decade since we had serious floods in Calder Valley on Boxing Day 2015. We had further floods in 2020. While the Environment Agency has carried out flood prevention works in Mythen Road and Brighouse, they haven't even made a start on planned schemes in Hebden Bridge and Elland. Could the Minister meet with me to discuss the plans that we have upcoming and get some action from the Environment Agency, because my constituents are understandably really anxious. Thank you.
Secretary of State.
I thank him very much for his question. I'm sure his constituents will be pleased to hear of the increase in funding over the next 2 years for supporting areas that are affected by flooding, and the review that we're consulting on to the flood funding formula to make sure that we are taking the most appropriate and effective steps necessary to protect communities and businesses from flooding. I'm sure my honourable friend, the Minister for Water, would be more than happy to meet with him to discuss his constituency concerns.
Simon Hall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Not the silver bullet, I know, but given the severity of the situation that we saw over the weekend, every little helps. Will the Secretary of State, he would earn huge plaudits if he was able to pull this off, convince the Environment Agency that it will be helpful to many of the communities in North Dorset, the South West and elsewhere to increase capacity of our rivers through a managed programme of dredging? We are losing capacity. I saw last week a river in my constituency, 2 arches of a bridge are entirely silted up. That's losing 20% of capacity. It's not the silver bullet, but capacity improvements will help.
Secretary of State.
I thank him for his comments. I know his constituency well, and I know what a champion he is for communities there. I'm sure he will welcome the fact that we are reviewing the formula with the Environment Agency to look at precisely what actions we can take that would be most effective protecting communities in whichever part of the country they find themselves in, including his very beautiful part of Dorset.
Larry Gardiner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In July last year, the previous government issued its 3rd National Adaptation Plan. And in March this year, the Committee on Climate Change issued its independent assessment of NAP3. It said that it falls short, far short of what is needed, that it lacks the pace and ambition to address growing climate risks, which we're already experiencing, and it fails to set out a compelling vision for what the government's well-adapted UK entails, with only around 40% of the short-term actions to address urgent risks identified in the previous climate change risk assessment. So will the Secretary of State ensure that the key recommendations of the Climate Change Committee in their assessment of NAP3, in particular to make sure that an urgent refresh of NAP3 takes place and that it must be strengthened to avoid locking in additional climate impacts, and key reforms must be implemented over the next year along with enforcement? Those are the recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change. Can he assure the House that he is taking those seriously and taking them forward?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to point to the impact of climate change in causing the much more frequent severe weather incidents we're seeing, whether that's droughts in the summer or floods at this time of year and through the winter. That is why we are reviewing the formula, reviewing our approach to managing flooding, but of course we take the reports and views of the committee very, very seriously as we continue to look at how we can best adapt to the challenges that climate change presents to the whole country.
David Chadwick.
People living in former mining communities across South Wales deserve greater reassurance on what the government's going to do about these coal tips. So can the government explain what exactly they're going to do to make these tips safe, particularly when it comes to the live monitoring of any movement and early warning systems?
Secretary of State.
I thank him for his question. There is a programme of improving maintenance of coal tips that is underway through the Welsh Government, and as I said earlier on, this is the first government to allocate funding to tackle that risk and the very, very serious implications that it has for people and communities living in affected areas.
Rachael Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Environment Agency for protecting much of my constituency. However, businesses still continue to flood. Could the Secretary of State say what he's doing to review the remit of Flood Re so that businesses, leaseholders and properties built after 2009 can have coverage by the Flood Re scheme, which really does help people through times of flooding?
Secretary of State.
I thank her for my question. As I indicated earlier, my honourable friend, the Minister for Water, has already chaired a round table with insurance providers, including Flood Re, to look at what more can be done to provide support. As things stand, 99% of the most high-risk households can now get quotes from over 15 providers for insurance, and 4 out of 5 homeowners with claims have seen a 50% reduction in their premiums for insurance. And we're also looking at what more can be done for businesses through the British Insurance Brokers Association.
Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I associate myself with the words of gratitude paid by the Secretary of State to all those who've helped over the weekend. The House will know that I've raised the situation of Tenbury Wells many times here. And of course, it's devastating to hear that Tenbury Wells was flooded again this weekend. And I don't know if in his meeting with Philip Duffy this morning, the Secretary of State was told that there is actually a really well-advanced design for flood defences for Tenbury Wells, which has also been very substantially funded thanks to previous allocations of funding. And I wondered if he could find it in his heart and in his 2.4 billion over the next 2 years, just to get that scheme over the line, please.
Secretary of State.
Well, I know her constituents will be very, very grateful for the way that she is championing their cause, particularly given the flooding that we've seen over the weekend. Now, the allocations of funding will be made in the usual way by the Environment Agency, working through their regional flood and coastal committees and engaging with local stakeholders. I'm sure that she will make sure her voice and the voice of her constituents are heard in that, as she makes a powerful case for funding the flood defences that she refers to.
Catherine Fuchs.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the Secretary of State will know that my constituency of Monmouthshire has some of the mightiest and most beautiful rivers, including the Wye, the Usk and the Monnow. But of course, having those incredible rivers means we are really at risk of flood. And yesterday we had 2 severe flood warnings. They've been downgraded today to 5 flood warnings, some of which are on the River Wye, which, as my right honourable friend knows, runs through England and Wales. I want to express my gratitude to Monmouthshire County Council and South Wales Fire and Rescue and all those in the community who helped, particularly Darren in Skenfrith, who has been up for 36 hours helping the community, and that community has been flooded 4 times in the last 3 years. So can the Secretary of State please assure me that he will encourage NRW and the Environment Agency to work together to solve those problems of flooding on those rivers that are cross-border? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Well, she makes a very important point. Of course, we need to ensure that the agencies that have responsibility for the same rivers or catchment areas operating cross-border work as effectively as they can do. And I will make sure those points are conveyed to both of the agencies.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for an advance copy of his statement. I want to say that the thoughts of my SNP colleagues and I are with the families of those who have lost their lives during Storm Bert. I also want to associate myself with his remarks regarding the response of the emergency services. Now, many unnamed storms occur in Scotland and in my constituency particularly, and for example recently part of the seawall in Gardiner came down, and I'm sure Storm Bert has made that worse. Now, I note the comments that the Secretary of State has made regarding additional support that could be made, and I'm simply asking him to confirm that with the coming storms that we will expect in Scotland, that you'll be able to make the same commitment for Scotland as well.
Secretary of State.
Yeah, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and yes, of course, the government will stand ready to support and help the devolved authorities whenever they are facing circumstances like these.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I also say that my thoughts are with all those affected over the weekend, and may I also thank everyone who's been protecting the public at this very difficult time. Madam Deputy Speaker, the river levels on the River Kennet, which is a tributary of the Thames, and indeed the Thames itself, have been rising to dangerous levels in recent hours. Could I ask the Secretary of State for an update on specific matters in the Thames Valley region, and in particular both on flood defence schemes in the Reading area and the vital work that he's preparing to do upstream to plant more trees and to rewild to avoid flooding?
I thank the honourable friend for his question. I'm sure he will welcome our proposals to review the formula so we can look at nature-based flood management in the way that he is describing. I will ask the Environment Agency to contact him with an update on what is going on in his constituency and what further action is being taken as the river continues to rise to ensure that his constituents are kept safe.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his statement, and can I also acknowledge the enormous work done by Philip Duffy in the Environment Agency. He came down to visit my constituents in Britford in the first quarter of this year and made an enormous impact. But in addition to the 30 million, which people of Salisbury are very grateful for the River Park scheme, which is just completed, it is important that smaller schemes driven by parishes like Britford Parish Council are given licence to combine both their own precept and investment from the Environment Agency to come up with bespoke schemes. Would he ensure that attention is given by the Environment Agency for how they can give as much flexibility as possible so small schemes can also move forward at a parish level?
Secretary of State.
I thank him for his question, and I echo his comments about Philip Duffy of the Environment Agency, but all his colleagues as well, who are doing an incredible job, and they always do, every time storms hit. I think he makes a very important point there, a very interesting point, about how we can better tie up different approaches to funding. I will take that back. I will discuss it with the EA, and I will ensure that he is written to with a full response.
Luke Charters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituency is home to a wonderful retirement community at Hartrig Oaks. However, residents living there have told me about how they worry every single time there's a storm about how the River Foss may overflow onto their property. But there is a fix, a water pump to alleviate flooding. This was removed shamefully by Yorkshire Water 3 years ago. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that Yorkshire Water should fix this urgently following Storm Bert?
Secretary of State.
I think it's important that we look at all possible ways that we can protect communities from flooding. I don't know the particular instance in detail that he is speaking about, but I'm happy to look at it, and me and my colleague, the Minister for Water, would be happy to meet with him to discuss what we can do to support him in what he's calling for.
Ian Room.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I refer the House to my register of interests. Would the Secretary of State join me in thanking firefighters from Devon and Somerset and Fire Rescue Service who have attended over 420 water incidents during Storm Bert, including many across my constituency in North Devon? And does the Secretary of State agree that community resilience for severe weather incidents should be a statutory duty with accompanying government funding in England, as it is in devolved nations?
Secretary of State.
I thank him for his comments, and of course I share his gratitude to those in the Devon and Somerset emergency services who are keeping people safe at this very, very difficult time. We are going to look with colleagues in the Home Office at whether further duties are required in order to ensure communities are safe when circumstances like this happen.
Claire Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just take this opportunity to put on record my thanks to all the agencies who worked so hard over the weekend in flood-affected areas of my constituency in really difficult circumstances, as well as my deepest condolences to the family and friends of Mr Brian Perry. As well as the police, fire and rescue, many of the teams involved in the search of this nature are staffed by volunteers such as Streatham Mountain Rescue, and we owe them all a huge debt of thanks. Can I thank my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, for the additional support which has been offered to the Welsh Government and colleagues in Wales in response to the devastation caused by Storm Bert, and ask what further contact will be had with the Welsh Government over the coming days?
Secretary of State.
Can I echo the condolences for the loss of life, and also my gratitude to those volunteers who have been engaged in supporting communities at this very difficult time. We will, of course, stay in regular contact with the government and other authorities in Wales to make sure that if they require further assistance, it is made available to them as quickly as it can be provided.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much. Storm Bert affected many parts of my constituency in the Scottish borders, and I pay tribute to the volunteers and emergency services who kept local residents safe. But many farmers have been particularly badly affected. So can I ask the Government if they made an assessment on crop yields, not just in Scotland but across the UK, as a direct result of Storm Bert?
Secretary of State.
I thank him for his question. Appropriate assessments will be made once we've had time to consider exactly what's gone on, but I'm sure that, like me, he will welcome the allocation of £60 million through the Farm Recovery Fund to support those farms who were devastated by flooding earlier in the year.
Sarah Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I draw the House's attention to my register of interests. My thoughts are with all those affected by Storm Bert, and as Chair of the Fire Brigade's Union Parliamentary Group, I want to express my solidarity and thanks to all of our emergency services, including firefighters on the front line. Extreme weather events are on the rise and becoming ever more frequent due to climate change, highlighting the urgent need for proper funding and resources. England is the only part of the UK without a statutory duty for flooding, leaving fire services underfunded and under-resourced to respond effectively. This must change. As the FBU has long called for, when will the Government finally provide a statutory duty for fire and rescue authorities to respond to flooding incidents in England? Furthermore, in our election manifesto, the Government committed to develop a national structure to inform policy and standards in the Fire and Rescue Service. When will this be implemented? And finally, will the FBU be invited to the Flood Resilience Task Force to ensure that the voice of firefighters is heard in shaping flood resilience strategies?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend for her question. The Fire and Rescue authorities have the powers to intervene, but she's quite right to point out there's not a duty, and officials in my department working with the Home Office will review that to see that that remains appropriate. My colleague, the Minister for Water, who now chairs the Flood Resilience Task Force, is happy to issue an invitation to the FBU to participate in that.
Sarah Dyke.
Madam Deputy Speaker, residents across Somerset are once again feeling incredibly anxious. Parts of Glastonbury and Somerton saw 130 millimetres of rain during Storm Bert over the weekend, which has placed additional strain on our ageing flood defence network. So does the Minister agree that due to the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather, we need to incentivise our farmers and landowners to urgently establish more nature-based flood solutions on their land and fund more extreme weather resilience plans for isolated rural communities?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to her for her question, and I share her concerns about the circumstances that we're seeing in Somerset, and I agree with the points that she is making. We've increased the number of actions available through ELM schemes to include more actions around natural flood management of precisely the kind that she is describing, and I look forward to seeing much more of that over the months and years to come.
Alex Boris Curtis.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. May I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and also reminding the House about the first-time funding for coal tips, which I noticed Plaid Cymru mentioned, but then couldn't leave the chamber quickly enough and couldn't wait for the end of the statement. Can I also pay tribute to local authorities and emergency services and volunteers, and to all those affected by Storm Bert in Cardiff, Rhymney and Tawe, and across South Wales. Can I ask that the Secretary of State speak to his DSIT colleagues to carefully look into the role of the Met Office here? It is clear that their response was slow, and that there was a clear underestimation of the impact of Storm Bert. They had put this at a yellow warning rather than amber, or they put it at yellow rather than amber or red. Our constituents have been let down by this incompetence before, and it cannot keep happening.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He should be reassured, and so should the whole House, that in most parts of the countries that were affected, warnings were given with adequate time for people to prepare. And I would encourage people to sign up on the DEFRA website or the Environment Agency website for warnings and alerts if they live in an area that could be affected by flooding. I'm aware of the particular concern that he mentions regarding the Met Office, and I will indeed be speaking to colleagues in DSIT as they review the circumstances of that and look at how the situation can be improved for future events of this kind.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And could I draw the Secretary of State attention to after the acute phase
of flooding, particularly in rural areas like mine, when I have small areas, small villages, which get affected and then struggle to get things sorted out. My example is Witherley in my constituency, which is small enough to be affected heavily by flooding that goes up through the roads, but then struggles to then have the capacity to actually get all the agencies to sort it out because of the funding. So when he looks at the funding model, would he consider that about the size? But also trying to pull these agencies together has taken me over a year to get them all in one place. We're meeting on the 13th of December to plan, but it's taken 10 years of work to try and get this all together. Would he look at the way of ensuring that the process is clear and spelled out for all the agencies of what they're accountable for, including the fire agency, including places like the water companies, so everyone knows, that, and most importantly, the public who are affected know who's accountable for what?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank him for his question, and I commend him for his work on trying to bring these different agencies together in his locality. That's precisely what we're trying to do at a national level with the Flood Resilience Task Force. And in fact, it would be helpful to have that task force look at how coordination is happening on the ground in different localities like his, particularly given how long he has been pushing for this to happen in a more effective way. Sadly, so far without success. I would very much like to see the National Task Force supporting him in that work, so he can deliver for his residents.
Yeah. Sean Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In places like Ironbridge Gorge, in my constituency, it's days later when the river comes down, the water comes down the river, and impacts on businesses and residences. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a real hammer blow for the economy in the World Heritage Site each and every time the temporary flood barriers are erected. Will the Secretary of State instruct the Environment Agency to come up with a plan and resource for frequently flooded areas, particularly when year on year it gets worse in places like Ironbridge Gorge? I would also extend an invitation for him to visit the gorge to see for himself.
Thank you very much for his invitation to visit the gorge, which I'd very much like to take him up on when time allows. I'm sure he will welcome the review of the flood funding formula, which will allow us to take different approaches to managing flooding in ways that will be much more effective. But also he should be aware that the Environment Agency will be carrying out their allocation of funding in the usual way through the relevant committees that they operate, and he should feed his views also into that.
Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This weekend, residents in my constituency of North Herefordshire were flooded yet again, and indeed it happened only 5 weeks ago. After that event, I met people in my surgery who showed me footage of floodwater spewing out of their toilet into their downstairs, who showed me their houses sodden. And I met more than 100 residents in the village of Ersland who raised their concern about this, and I know that is widespread across the county and the constituency. With that flood in October, more than 100 households in Herefordshire were flooded, and yet the flood recovery framework was not initiated because ministers felt that the flooding was not widespread and severe enough. Now, so I would like to ask the Minister, the Secretary of State, please will he consider the terms under which the flood recovery framework is initiated? It provides vital support that councils can pass on, immediate grants to communities and businesses, council tax and business rates relief that can help that recovery. Will he consider how that is triggered and consider giving that responsibility to the local level, to local authorities who are by far the best placed to judge when it is required? In addition to all that we need in terms of flood resilience, this immediate support is crucial at times like this. Thank you.
Secretary of State.
May I extend my sympathies to her constituency in North Herefordshire for the distressing experiences that they've had through this, and I'm sure previous episodes of flooding as well. I think she's quite right to ask how we can improve the flooding formula and how we can get agencies working better on the front line. It's possible to do that through the consultation we've launched on the formula. I hope she will feed into that, and I'm sure we can get to a position where the formula works far better for her constituents in North Herefordshire as well as every other part of the country.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been contacted by residents in Draycott, Marchington, Rollston and others in my constituency who've been affected by flooding this weekend. This is a persistent problem that impacts these areas every time we experience heavy rainfall. Can the Secretary of State outline what work his department is undertaking with county councils and other agencies to ensure that rivers are properly maintained and drains are regularly cleared to prevent this reoccurring devastation?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank him for his question, and I empathise, of course, with the suffering that constituencies of his have experienced because of this recent flooding. We are reviewing the formula. We realise it's not working as effectively as it should do. We will be looking through the Flood Resilience Task Force as well at how we can better coordinate on the ground in localities across the different agencies that have responsibility, first of all for keeping people safe, but then for helping communities to recover after there has been flooding of the kind that he's described.
Leila Moran.
Speaker, residents in South Abingdon have already flooded twice this year, and tonight there is another warning. I cannot imagine what they must be feeling. When I visited them in September, they reported feeling very alone, having been promised a flood defence and then the Environment Agency saying that it wasn't value for money, and having been promised sandbags and then them not showing up. Today, we asked the EA if they would go and be on the ground, and they told us that they couldn't send enough people, not because they don't have the staff or the money, but because not enough of them had completed a workplace assessment and training over how not to be assaulted by angry residents. Now, of course, staff safety is everything, and Environment Agency workers deserve our thanks. But surely an element of common sense needs to be applied. The best way to help angry residents is to be there and help them in their hour of need, surely.
Yeah.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful for the point that she makes. I would be happy to raise that with the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency to make sure that where there is an urgent need for support and there are staff available to provide it, that is what happens.
Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for coming to Derby last year to see our flood defences and to meet with firefighters who had saved lives and property when Derbyshire was hit with floods. Could I echo the calls to explore with the Home Office putting water rescue that they do on a statutory footing, and could he give an update about the next phase of Derby's flood defence work?
Secretary of State.
Well, it was a great pleasure to visit her constituency and to meet some of the firefighters and emergency responders, so I could thank them personally, together with her, for the work that they always carry out when we are in circumstances like this. She refers to the duty that may be required on fire and the emergency services to respond to circumstances like this. Currently there is a power, but there is no duty. I will be engaging with colleagues in the Home Office to see whether we need to extend that further to put in place the duty, and I will be sure to keep her updated as those conversations progress.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A couple of weeks ago I held a round table with some mid-Buckinghamshire farmers on measures that are required to mitigate against flooding, particularly in extreme weather events such as we've seen this weekend with Storm Bert. At the top of the list was the point my honourable friend for North Dorset made about dredging and river capacity. But on top of that in Buckinghamshire, there are communities like Calvert, Green and Fleet Marston that are flooding for the first time in decades, and that is a result of some of the big infrastructure we are seeing being built, particularly HS2, where they will concrete over a field completely, it seems, unaware that that will have a knock-on effect to farmland next door. So will the Secretary of State commit to working with the Transport Secretary, and I also suggest the Deputy Prime Minister, given their plans to concrete over the countryside, to ensure that where construction takes place, proper, and I really mean proper, flood mitigation measures are put into place?
I thank him for his question. I think he makes an important point. We do need to look at dredging and other means by which we can ensure that we are mitigating against the risk of flooding. He's quite right too. This needs to operate cross-government, and we will have those conversations and ensure that measures are put in place to support communities as much as is possible from the more severe weather events that we're seeing as a result of climate change.
Chris Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as the Minister was speaking, the water levels on the River Ouse continued to rise. That means tonight my constituents in Newport Pagnell are once again bracing themselves, and they're preparing their homes, businesses and farms for the second flooding incident in just a few weeks. Would my right honourable friend join me in praising the dedicated volunteers of the Newport Pagnell Flood Action Group for their tireless work protecting our local town? Would he also like to pay tribute to our local firefighters who are responding to this incident? They have a water response unit in Newport Pagnell which deals with incidents across the area, and to declare my interest, my brother is one of those brave local firefighters who's currently responding to an incident in Beaconsfield. And could he also outline what steps this government is taking to ensure that communities like Newport Pagnell are better safeguarded against flooding in the future?
Secretary of State.
I thank you very much for his question. I share his praise for volunteers and the emergency services, and particularly, of course, for his brother, for the work that they're carrying out. I'm sure he will welcome the review that we're carrying out of the funding formula to make sure that all appropriate steps are taken for whichever part of the country may be affected to improve resilience against the kind of flooding that we've seen over recent days. I know that the Environment Agency is aware of the rising levels in the Ouse and other slower moving rivers and are taking appropriate steps to safeguard people in Newport Pagnell and other parts of his constituency, and indeed along the rest of those rivers who may be affected as those river levels continue to rise.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I note from the Secretary of State's statement that the Flood Resilience Task Force is to ensure better coordination between central government and frontline agencies. Can the Secretary of State advise if any of those agencies, local authorities, or indeed devolved administrations have requested military assistance through the MACA process? And if they have, are they being considered? And will they also consider including the Ministry of Defence on his Flood Resilience Task Force?
Secretary of State.
I thank you for his question. Yes, the devolved authorities were represented on the Flood Resilience Task Force. We want to coordinate with them better as well and ensure that they're also coordinating with their own agencies and frontline staff who are charged with protecting communities from the very devastating impacts of flooding.
Mike Reader.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the House has heard today, a major incident has been declared in Northamptonshire. There is a risk to life in my constituency and in the constituency of my neighbour, the Honourable Member for South Northamptonshire. But over 1,000 people have now been evacuated from Billing Aquadrome. But we've seen hundreds of workers from the Council, the EA, Anglian Water, Emergency Services and volunteers and residents group working around the clock to make sure that my neighbours are kept safe. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the collaboration I'm seeing in Northampton demonstrates the vital importance of the Flood Resilience Task Force that he's announced, which will bring together multiple agencies to work together to protect towns like mine?
Minister.
I thank you for his question. Of course, I had the pleasure of visiting the Aquadrome. Very sad indeed to hear that it's been flooded yet again. But I think he's right to point to the fact that it's not just about increasing funding, important though that is. It's also about getting the agencies on the ground to coordinate better, both at a national, a regional and a very, very local level.
Dr Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have a flood alert at the moment in Rhymney and Weybridge, but it takes a few days for the water to make its way down to us, so we won't know the full impact or not of Storm Bert. What we hope is that there won't be a repeat of what happened in Storm Henk earlier this year, where constituents were passed from pillar to post due to all the different myriad of statutory responders during a flood emergency. What is the task force going to do to help fix this? And would he support my campaign for an individual point of contact and coordination, a flood control centre for Rhymney and Weybridge, and hopefully for all of our constituencies to support our residents in a flood emergency?
Minister.
Well, the role of the Flood Resilience Task Force is not just to ensure that there is better coordination at a national level and between national and local agencies, but also at the local level in the way that he is describing. Coordination happens far better, but also much better communication to residents so they know who to contact in a much more simple way to get the support and help that they need, both when floods are coming, but also as areas recover from the impacts of flooding.
Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the ways in which my Hazel Grove constituents have been impacted by Storm Bert is as passengers on our rail network facing severe delays and cancellations, particularly on the West Coast main line. So could the Secretary of State please update the House on the conversations he's had with colleagues from the Department for Transport on how to minimise the impact and how to ensure we learn the right lessons so that future flooding causes even fewer impacts in future?
Minister.
I thank her for her question. We're in close contact with colleagues in the Department for Transport, and of course safety must be the priority both for passengers and for people who are working as part of the crews on the trains or on the ground. The railway lines will be opened as soon as it is safe to do that. We are aware that there will be further steps that need to be taken to protect all forms of public transport, and indeed all parts of the country, from the increased level that we're seeing of more severe weather incidents.
Ben Obsigetti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Flooding Minister recently confirmed to me that the Government's new Floods Resilience Task Force brings together a range of partners, including the Environment Agency, devolved administrations, selected regional mayors and lead local flood authorities. But in recent flooding caused by the high levels of the River Great Ouse last month in Brampton and St Ives, Cambridgeshire County Council informed me that their role as lead local flood authority was not a lead role, but a supporting one. And residents have been understandably frustrated by the lack of clarity around who owns what. So can the Secretary of State offer some clarity as to which agency leads the multi-agency response during a flooding event, and how is this reflected in how they interact with the Floods Resilience Task Force?
Minister.
I'm grateful for the point he raises. It's a very important one. Part of the role of the Flood Resilience Task Force will be to ensure that there is clarity on the ground, area by area, as to who are the lead responders and how coordination is happening in a way that will provide the maximum benefit to people who are at risk of being affected by flooding.
Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope that the Minister will join with me in thanking the workers for Torbay Council, where they've stepped up to help out residents across Torbay during Storm Bert. Also would highlight to colleagues the fact that what we've seen is deep cuts to the budget for flood defence under the previous government, and that has now haunted us. Would the Minister also reflect on a piece of critical infrastructure, which is our Dawlish rail line? There is the Dawlish Rail Resilience Programme 5 that remains up on the shelf. It hasn't been funded yet. Will you make any assurances that this will be funded to protect this vital piece of infrastructure?
Minister.
I thank him for his question, and I share his thanks to those who have been involved in protecting people from the impact of flooding. I can write to him about the specific question he raises about the Dawlish Railway.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just remind members that I'm the chair of the Flooding and Flooded Communities All-Party Group. Large areas of North Shropshire are often underwater, either from river flooding or from prolonged rainfall, and this weekend has been no exception, with villages cut off for long periods of time and vast swathes of farmland flooded. This year, there are farmers who have been unable to plant crops in the current harvest that's just been collected and are also not going to be able to next year. They're in a desperate state. Will the Secretary of State, when he reviews the flooding formula and the funding, consider how farmers are going to be compensated for the fact that they are storing vast quantities of water upstream, whether they like it or not? Thank you.
Minister.
I thank you for a question, and of course we can take that into account when we're looking at the flooding formula, but I'm sure she will welcome, as I do, the additional £60 million made available in the budget for farmers who have been affected by the severe levels of flooding experienced earlier in the year.
Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Advice from Great Western Railways this morning said, do not travel. So following on from the question from my honourable friend, the member for Hazel Grove, how many meetings has the Minister had with the Secretary of State for Transport about resilience to the Great Western Railway?
Minister.
I think it's always wise to follow the advice that is given for safety, and of course we're in regular contact with colleagues in the Department for Transport and other parts of government to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep people safe.
Holly Maynard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituency of Witney has got the Windrush, the Evenlode and the Thames in it, all of which have really impacted constituents today. One of the things that we just lost out on was some FIPL funding, Farming and Protected Landscapes, to produce modelling on the Windrush, which is upstream of Witney, our key market town in the constituency. And that means that we are unable to forecast how we can lower the flood crest and slow the flood crest through Witney, which will make Witney safer. Please could you look into better funding or enlarging the funding for that such modelling so that we keep towns like Witney safe on rivers like the Windrush?
Minister.
Yeah, I recognise the points that he's making. We'll be making announcements on FIPL early in the new year.
Finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you. Everybody knows when I'm called that it's all over. almost, you know. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his very positive action plan and strategy that he's brought forward. And can I also send my sincere sympathy to all those who lost their lives and those who are particularly anxious and worried and depressed about their properties. And those are serious things for people who don't know what they're going to do next, you know. Will the Secretary of State outline what discussions have taken place with counterparts in the Northern Ireland Assembly to ensure that the Assembly and local communities have the ability to quickly regroup and get a handle on the devastating flooding that has taken place without this United Kingdom? And particularly, can I ask the Minister, I wish I had the answer for this, I don't have the answer, so I'm going to ask the Secretary of State that question. One of the great things that's coming forward is where is accommodation, alternative accommodation for those who are flooded out? Has the Minister, Secretary of State, been able to give any attention to that particular question? And if so, would those answers and those queries be shared with those people back home? Thanks so much.
Well, they say it's not over till the fat lady sings. I'm not sure that they had the honourable gentleman in mind when that particular phrase was coined. I'm in regular contact with the devolved authorities, including on flooding. They sit on the Flood Resilience Task Force. It's important that there is coordination across all parts of government across the UK to ensure that we can provide appropriate support for people in precisely the circumstances that he describes when flooding hits.
That's the end of the statement. I'll give the front benches a few moments to